On the morning of May 19, 1845, the docks at Greenhithe, England, were crowded with waving families. 129 men stood aboard two of the most advanced ships the Royal Navy had ever built, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. They carried steam engines, iron-reinforced hulls, libraries of more than 1,000 books, and 3 years' worth of food. Their commander, Sir John Franklin, was a national hero. Their mission? To conquer the last blank space on the map, the Northwest Passage. From Greenland, the men mailed cheerful letters home. Then they sailed into Baffin Bay and vanished. All of them. Not one of the 129 ever came home. For nearly 180 years, what happened out there on the ice remained the greatest mystery in the history of exploration. Until now. Because DNA has finally begun giving the dead their names back. And the truth they carried is darker than the Victorian world could ever bring itself to admit. For generations, the disappearance was a blank canvas for theories. Ships crushed by ice, food that turned to poison, madness in the endless polar night, even whispers of an Arctic curse. But there was one rumor so disturbing that Victorian Britain simply refused to hear it. In 1854, explorer John Rae returned from the Arctic, carrying Inuit testimony about what the starving survivors had been forced to do. London Society, led by Charles Dickens himself, buried the report and destroyed Rae's reputation. Civilized British sailors, they insisted, did not do such things. Remember that rumor. We will come back to it, because 170 years later, science has finally delivered its verdict. At first, the silence was not alarming. Arctic expeditions often disappeared for years. But silence became dread, and dread became panic. Dozens of search expeditions combed the ice. More ships and men were lost looking for Franklin than sailed with him. In 1850, searchers found the first trace: 3 graves on Beechey Island, perfectly preserved in the permafrost. Young sailors who had died in the expedition's very first winter. If men were already dying in year 1, something had gone terribly wrong. The full horror surfaced in 1859 when Francis Leopold McClintock found a stone cairn on King William Island. Inside lay a single sheet of paper, the Victory Point Note, the only written record of the disaster ever recovered. Its margins told the story in 3 brutal lines. The ships had been trapped in the ice since September 1846. Sir John Franklin died on June 11, 1847, and in April 1848, the 105 survivors abandoned both ships and began marching south, dragging lifeboats loaded with supplies across the frozen sea toward a mainland hundreds of miles away. Not one of them survived the march. Weeks after finding the note, McClintock made another discovery: a skeleton lying face down in the snow, exactly where the man had fallen. He carried a seaman's pocketbook, pages of handwritten notes and poetry. But here was the puzzle. The papers belonged to Harry Pegler, captain of the foretop on HMS Terror, while the body wore the uniform of a ship's steward. The wrong clothes. For 166 years, historians argued about who this man really was, and he was only the beginning. Across King William Island and the Adelaide Peninsula, searchers kept finding bones, scattered, unburied, anonymous. 129 men had sailed, and the Arctic had turned them into nameless remains. Who were they? For most of 2 centuries, the answer seemed lost forever. Then the breakthroughs came in waves. In 2014, Canadian divers located HMS Erebus resting on the seafloor. 2 years later, HMS Terror was found, astonishingly preserved, plates still on shelves. But ships can only tell you where the story ended, not what happened, not who the bones belonged to. That required something new. Researchers from the University of Waterloo, Trent University, and Lakehead University began extracting DNA from bones and teeth recovered across the Arctic, then hunting for living descendants of the crew through naval records, church archives, and family trees stretching back 200 years. It was genealogical detective work on an enormous scale, and incredibly, it worked. In 2021 came the first name, John Gregory, engineer of HMS Erebus, the first man of the Franklin expedition ever identified by DNA, a name returned after 170 years. Then more, able seaman William Orren, subordinate officers steward John Bridgens, sailor David Young. The dead were coming back, one name at a time. And then, in 2025, scientists finally reached the skeleton in the wrong uniform. DNA from the remains was matched against a living descendant, and a 166-year-old debate ended in a single lab result. It was Harry Peglar himself. The mismatched clothes tell their own quiet story. By the end, the freezing survivors wore whatever could keep a man alive for one more day. And the identification changed history in a second way. Peglar's pocketbook, the only personal writings ever recovered from the expedition, now speaks with a confirmed human voice. An ordinary sailor, scribbling poetry while his world ended around him. Which leaves the rumor, the one Victorian Britain refused to hear. In September 2024, researchers extracted DNA from a jawbone found at Erebus Bay and matched it to a living descendant. The bone belonged to Captain James Fitzjames, commander of HMS Erebus and one of the most senior officers of the entire expedition. And across that jawbone ran straight, deliberate cut marks, the kind left by a blade. After Fitzjames died, his starving shipmates did exactly what the Inuit had described 170 years earlier. John Ray had told the truth. Dickens and the Empire had shouted him down. And the marks on an officer's jaw expose one final, leveling truth. In the end, rank meant nothing. Hunger erased the Royal Navy's hierarchy. Captain and cabin boy died the same way, and the living honored no uniform. So what really killed the Franklin expedition? Not one villain, a conspiracy of them. 2 summers in a row when the ice never melted. Tinned food sealed with lead, scurvy, tuberculosis, and finally, starvation beyond imagination. But the deeper answer is this: what killed them was certainty. An empire so sure its technology had conquered nature that it sailed 129 men into the one place on Earth where certainty is fatal. The Arctic didn't defeat the Royal Navy's finest, it simply outlasted them. Today, 6 of those men have their names back. 123 are still out there in the ice, waiting. Researchers are asking descendants of the crew to come forward with DNA samples. So if your family tree reaches back to Victorian England, one of them may be waiting for you. Would you want to know? Tell me in the comments which mystery science should solve next, and subscribe because we bring history's cold cases into the lab, one episode at a time.